Hey everyone, just jumping on today to chat about chapter 3 in the NBCOT prep book. And we are talking today about teaching and learning process, therapeutic use of self, and clinical reasoning. So we're going to start with the teaching and learning process, something that seems to be, again, a foundational object or a foundational theory that we need to know, along with clinical reasoning and teaching and learning. So these first couple of chapters in the book really want to lay that foundation, and then we'll move into more of those diagnoses and things that you're going to be treating as a therapist. So looking at the principles of learning first, let's talk about that. The biggest thing with learning and teaching is that you need to understand how your individual is learning. So teaching and learning process, it's the process by which us as occupational therapists design opportunities to encourage the individual to acquire knowledge and skills needed for living. Acquire knowledge and skills. This could be when we're doing habituation, so teaching people who have never had those skills, or it could be rehabilitation, reteaching those skills based off of how those people are able to learn. And if they've had some sort of a disease or an accident or something that has hindered the way in which they learn. So that's our role as OTs. Principles of learning. So this would be our client's ability to learn from us. It is influenced by their interest, their age, their sex, their socio-cultural factors, their assets and limitations. Meaning, what can they learn? Because maybe they've had a brain injury, maybe they have CP and they have some cognitive deficits, but they may have a strong interest in something, so that holds their attention to that task. Maybe they're really good readers. What are their assets and their limitations? Another principle is their attention to learning. What does that mean? Can they attend for 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Do they attend better if they are doing rather than sitting and listening? How about the motivation to engage in learning? How are you going to motivate those learners? That's a lot of that why. Why are we doing this? If they don't know the why, oftentimes many of us aren't going to learn or listen or be motivated to learn because we can't figure out how that's going to apply to our life. Allowing the individual to make goals increases the chance of them actually meeting those goals. Okay, so always leave time when you are preparing to teach somebody something, but that principle of learning for them, include them in that goal writing, include them in identifying why that's important to them, and you're going to have better success with them coming to therapy and wanting to engage in learning those tasks or learning those skills or learning those adaptive techniques. Learning is done within the individual's capabilities. So if you know that somebody has a cognitive decline, or maybe they just have a lower literacy. Maybe they only learned or read at a 5th grade level. You need to make sure that you're accommodating that into your therapy. You don't want to be throwing out words like range of motion, manual muscle testing, hemi dressing techniques. Just talk to them in layman's terms, and that is going to allow them that better capacity to learn. Maybe they can't attend longer than 1 to 2 minutes. So having them sit and listen to you for 25 minutes probably isn't going to engage them in a true learning process. And then actively participating in the learning task increases learning through experiential learning. Okay, so that means if they are engaged or bringing forward their own experiences with this. You guys do this every day in class if you are able to get into small groups and talk about experiences. If you're able to be a part of a pro bono clinic, you're experiencing what it's like to treat a client, and you can bring that back to the classroom and apply it to new tasks that you're asked to learn, whether it's new treatment ideas, a new diagnosis. You're bringing in that knowledge and that experience into the next thing that you haven't had any experience with. Learning increases through trial and error, shaping, feedback, practicing in different areas, and then simple to complex. Trial and error is our basic learning. That's what you do as a child. That's what we do when we're first learning something. We try to hold an object like this, and then we try to cut like this, and it doesn't work. So we keep changing that. Shaping is helping to guide that person into that right direction. Feedback, you Remember, internal and external feedback. You start with external and you hope that you are able to engage that individual in the ability that they can provide that internal feedback to themselves. Practicing in different areas. Talk about this as generalization. Big word, okay? That's a key word that I'm going to talk about in a second too, but practicing in different areas allows that person to generalize those skills to cooking at home, their parents, their friend's house, allows them to generalize putting on their shoes at home, at school, changing shoes at the gym. Simple to complex, starting with something basic, one step of a task, and then creating a experience where maybe they're applying that skill to a more complex task. So maybe buttering toast is part of cooking for them for many days, just buttering the toast, making it in the toaster, and then they're going to make a whole breakfast. Things that can impact learning are anxiety, conflict, and frustration. So as an OT, making sure that you're able to identify when that's kicking in and helping them to have that just right challenge. That's why we have that. We want them to always be learning, not shutting down. Learning also in real life situations and different contexts allows for that learning and generalization of knowledge and skills. We're not always given that opportunity if you're in acute care or a traditional outpatient clinic, but encouraging them to go and try some of those tasks that you've taught them, that they've learned, maybe trying eating at a restaurant, at a friend's house, attempting to shower at home and also in a hotel. And as they apply that knowledge, getting dressed at home, getting dressed in the hospital, getting dressed at a friend's house or in a hotel, how does that look different? But how do you apply those same skills of hemi dressing across that? Is that generalization of skills. Okay, so that's learning. That is learning for the client. And these are very important because again, this is going to come into those application type questions where they're asking you, how are you going to increase the learning of your client? Or what are they currently doing? Are you generalizing the skill in this scenario? Are you using block practice for them? What does that look like? So then when we move into teaching methods, this is us as the therapist teaching that individual. And this is important because we want to make sure that we are teaching in a way that elicits their learning to the highest ability. Teaching methods, ways to present information or tasks to a person. That's what we're looking at here. One way is through demonstration and performance. Now, the demonstration and performance is going to be the therapist demonstrating that task, and then the individual is going to copy the therapist's performance. Okay, so this is kind of a shadowing or copycat, demonstrate and performance. Looking at exploration and discovery. A diversity of activities is made available and then the individual can choose what they want to do. So you're going to give them lots of options, or you're going to give them two options. We're going to work on sensory defensiveness with a kiddo. So you may set out shaving cream, a rice bin with lots of items, and maybe some different cloths, different feeling textures, and you're going to let them choose what they want to start with. That would be exploration and discovery. They're going to get to pick, and then they're still working on that task. Explanation and discussion. Okay, the therapist is going to explain why, and then there's going to be a dialect or a discussion between the therapist and that client. These things might be great for working with caregivers with somebody with dementia. This could be great to have that explanation and discussion when looking at driving. Let's explain all the rules of the road and explain all of those things that could hinder safety with driving, and then have a discussion about it. Role playing. Role playing is great. Role playing is great for a lot of psychosocial activities, whether that's in a group or in an individual setting. Having kiddos role play how to respond to an emotion or a situation. Oh, you just got in trouble by the teacher. How are you going to respond? Role playing could be individuals who have depression, anxiety, maybe some social difficulties interacting with people, and they're going to role play. Simulation. Simulation is huge for a lot of things because we do a lot of therapy in simulated situations. We're not in the client's home. We're not able to be in the kiddo's classroom with them all the time, but we're going to simulate a tub transfer. We're going to simulate a car transfer. Problem solving. This is getting to that higher. So this is that higher level of learning for your client. You are going to be teaching that client how to problem solve these situations with the tools you've given them. So problem solving could be how, let's say they are going to be cooking or they're going to be getting dressed or something like that. And what they need is at a higher shelf, okay, than they can reach. And they have decreased balance. And the object that they need, whether it's a sweater or it's a box of cereal, is a little too heavy for a grabber or a reacher. You need to have and identify their problem solving abilities. This really, really hones in putting an individual at that modified independence or independence level because it's safety. Problem solving is a lot of our safety strategies that we're teaching clients. Audio visual aids. Some of you are maybe watching this because just reading a book is not enough. You don't learn that way. Okay, and you need to be taught through that audio, that visual, maybe looking at different things. When we look at repetition and practice, this is something that you can do a lot with home exercise programs. Hemi dressing techniques. Repetition is going to build that neural network and hopefully help it heal. If there was a neurological infarct or there was damage to our brain, our spinal cord, even a peripheral nerve damage, it is also something that helps with that habituation. Teaching those kids, teaching those younger people or people that have never had that skill, what that skill is. And so it's a lot of practice. And you learned in school the different types of practice, random practice, blocked practice. Okay, so reviewing those types of things. Behavioral management. So behavioral management is identifying behaviors that require development, whether it's social skills, and how do we promote the right behaviors and extinguish those behaviors that are going to hinder their learning, okay, or your ability to teach them. So you are teaching them how to identify those behaviors. A lot of times we do this with kiddos in social situations. No, we don't hit somebody when we're upset. We don't kick our teacher. We don't, pull the hair of my sibling just because I'm upset, slam doors. So you're teaching those behavioral modifications so that they then can learn how to interact appropriately. And then finally, our last teaching method is reaching out to those consumers, the families, and caregiver education. This is a huge component at all points across the lifespan. What are we doing? We're trying to make sure that they understand everything that you're teaching that client to grow their knowledge, which will grow the support given to that client to learn, okay? Looking at methods of prevention or secondary problems are also provided in that consumer role. So a great example, just did a video yesterday on why occupational therapists need to be involved in cancer treatments from the beginning all the way through, hopefully completing that treatment and recovering. Because we need to make sure that we're preventing secondary problems, falling, social isolation, depression, feeling of unworthiness for somebody who's just sitting and recovering or sitting and dealing with the side effects of their treatment. And so that's a huge component of that teaching method, and it allows that individual to further learn if we're teaching those caregivers the needs that that person has, and that caregiver is fostering an environment that is wanting them to learn more about how to learn new skills or recover from something. So that's teaching and learning, okay? The next section in here that is very important, and it's just at the end of that teaching and learning, is understanding health literacy. Understanding health literacy. Health literacy is so, so important. And when in practice or when you're on your fieldworks, you notice this, and it can, if you don't catch it, really hinder the carryover or the abilities of that client or family or group. So health literacy is allowing people to make health-related decisions while respecting their culture and making the information easy to understand. I used to show a video on this, on health literacy, and it was about medication management. And it's scary how much people don't understand, and that's not their fault. We don't take a class in high school on health literacy, but you need to understand that as a practitioner. The video I showed is showing everyday people talking about their health issues or how they take care of their children when there's a health concern. One gentleman thought hypertension meant that he was a hyper individual, and he had been on high blood pressure medications for many years. And so when they asked him, well, what do you think hypertension means? He said, it means I'm hyper and I can't sit still. Another individual thought that she was going in. She had had some women troubles. She went to the doctor. They said, oh, yep, we can clear this up. She was 30 some years old, early 30s, signed the paper, came in the next day. They did a hysterectomy and she was not aware of that. That was what was going to be happening. She was very overwhelmed with the paperwork. So she ended up with a hysterectomy, not knowing that she was, losing the ability to have children and all of those things. So health literacy, huge. It's going to show up. Maybe it's not going to be, a ton of questions, but it's going to show up in this because it is such a concern right now in today's society, making sure that we understand different cultures. And that is something that you guys need to be aware of, that I think I've maybe said in a previous video. There's going to be questions about how do you handle somebody with a different language that speaks a different language, okay? And you're going to have to be able to identify the appropriate or the best option for that. Funny story with that, I went into a room once, knew that they did not speak English at all. Went in, there was a card on the desk that had Spanish words and pictures for those words on it. Started speaking Spanish to the individual who had had a stroke. They were looking at me funny, so I thought they had cognitive impairments along with their stroke. Went in the hall, found out they speak Russian. Okay, so identifying those things, and that's just a funny story because I thought, man, this person's going to struggle, and I think they were looking at me like, don't understand English. Now they're speaking Spanish to me, and found out that they were Russian speaking. So making sure that you guys understand those questions, they're going to pop up. Okay, they are going to pop up on your test. Moving right into clinical reasoning, everything that a therapist does or uses when thinking about a client and how they are and who their disability affects them. So who are they? Okay, so every time when we look at clinical reasoning, we're going to be thinking about our client, who they are, and how that disability affects them. That's our clinical reasoning 101. Okay, so clinical reasoning 101. Value of OT. It's going to improve our clinical decision-making, explaining the rationales behind our decisions, and it's going to improve your job satisfaction because you'll understand why what you're doing is so important. Okay, so clinical reasoning is so important for us as occupational therapists. Again, you learn about this. We just talked about teaching and learning. You got to understand how to explain to your clients why it is what you're doing, not only to your client, but also in your documentation to insurance, to stakeholders in your therapy company, whether that's your outpatient facility, your inpatient facility. You have to be able to articulate why what you're doing is good and helpful, and how that's adding to the profession, to that client's life, etc. There are different types of clinical reasoning. We talked about some of these, but we're going to kind of review these on the whiteboard real quick. All right, so here are some of those reasoning things. We talked about this in the previous section, but it's so important to go back over this. So we have procedural reasoning, scientific reasoning. So this is really looking at the OT problems, our goal setting. What did you get from that evaluation? Okay, so, and then the actual techniques of doing the practice. So using some of that evidence to help you figure out what you're going to do. The interactive reasoning is really going to pull in that therapeutic relationship. Okay, so that interactive reasoning is dealing with how the disability can affect that person. You're focusing on that person as an individual. You're using therapeutic self to really bond, or therapeutic relationship to help them bond with you and plan what the steps are going to be for their therapy, and for that whole gamut of what and how this affects their individual lives. Narrative reasoning is going to be that occupational story of that individual. Okay, so that individual is going to tell you the story. That's going to help you identify what their roles are, who they are as a person, and then how that injury or that deficit is really going to impact that individual's life. Okay, so narrative reasoning is just storytelling. And as that story unfolds, you're able to identify, hey, they're a dad of 3 kids. They live in the country. They love having their animals, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what narrative reasoning is, taking that story, and you as the therapist, okay, for clinical reasoning, are going to apply that story to what you're going to determine to do with that individual. Pragmatic reasoning is thinking of the context in which the OT is going to be doing their services. Okay, so are you going to think about this in the context of them going to work? Are you using clinical reasoning because that individual is going to work? For me, a lot of my clinical reasoning right now is applied to how are they going to function in the home? Okay, so my clinical reasoning may not be looking at flying on an airplane. It may not be going to work, because a lot of my clients are at home and want to remain at home. So my pragmatic reasoning is looking into that. It also needs to focus on what can you do within that clinical setting. So if I'm at home, I'm probably not going to be putting them into a pool. I'm not going to be doing aquatic therapy. If I was in the hospital in acute care, I'm probably not going to have them do a cooking task. There's not a kitchen for me to have them do that. So you really need to look at that context and then identify where your issues might lie and where some of your decisions for that treatment might have to be passed on to the next setting. So if I'm in acute care, it may be passed on to a SNF or an inpatient rehab to look at that. And that's going to determine my referral process. If I am truly concerned about them cooking, am I going to say that they should go home from acute care? Probably not. I'm probably going to refer them on to inpatient or a SNF. And then conditional reasoning, the ongoing revision of treatment. So we're always looking at, is my treatment plan working? Should I continue to do this? That is guided by insurance, but it's also something that you do after every session. That didn't really work. Or after every activity, okay? And this is going to really look at multidimensional thinking, meaning, okay, is this working to rehab them, or should I go with adaptive equipment? Is this person plateauing in their rehab, or are they plateauing in their habilitation, their ability to learn how to write, to learn how to read? Do I pull in a different task now? Do I pull in an adaptive device that's going to write for that person, or read, or comprehend, or whatever it may be? So those are the 5 areas of reasoning that are involved in that clinical reasoning place, okay? So clinical reasoning is, again, very, very key. And when you look at this for the NBCOT exam, clinical reasoning, again, is going to fly through all sorts of sections. It was previously discussed in a different section, okay, the previous section 2, I believe, chapter 2, but it's going to flow through your whole exam. It just isn't going to be blatantly saying, what type of reasoning is this, or how would you apply these types of reasoning? That could be a potential question, but your reasoning is what you're doing on this whole exam to determine what you should be doing with these clients in all the different settings. So it's a great revisit of it. It's come up twice in 3 chapters. So you need to understand these different reasonings. Okay, there's a reason it's in here 2 different times already out of 3 chapters. The next thing that we're going to look at, and the final thing for this section, is therapeutic use of self. And this, you guys may have spent a whole class on this. You might have looked at this before doing a group class or a form of a group course. What's the purpose of therapeutic use of self? So the first thing is identifying therapeutic use of self, which is our conscious ability and our planned ability to interact with individuals, families, other people. We have to be able to change and morph who we are based on the situation. Why is that? Why do we got to do that as practitioners? Well, the purpose of therapeutic use of self is to provide reassurance and alleviate stress or fear to our clients. If we go in and we start just dictating and playing the coaching role, and we have this cute, sweet 9-year-old lady who is so afraid, lives on her own, just had a stroke, doesn't know what's going on, and you're in there going, okay, let's get up, let's move. That's not going to help her with that fear. But if I come in and I kneel down beside her on the bed and I talk very gently to her and I say, hey, Betty, today we're going to just first start by getting into this wheelchair. I'm right here. I'm not going to let you fall. Okay, that is a nice form of reassurance. It's also therapeutic use of self allows us to be able to give advice. If that person is trusting us and comfortable with us, they are going to be listening to the advice we're giving. They're going to trust in what you're saying. It allows you to obtain needed information. Good examples of that, I worked a lot with people in trouble with the law. Okay, I have worked with people who were going to go on trial for murder, people who were identified as being involved in gang shootings. What does that mean? I need to understand what life is like for them. And if I go in and they're fearful that I am an authority figure, that I'm going to turn them in for what they say, I'm going to rat them out to other gangs, to the police about, how their business flows, they're never going to tell me. But as a therapist, if their goal, truthfully, is to go back to living in a home and that's what they're going to do, I need to understand how I'm going to help them. I'm going to encourage them not to go back to drug dealing or not to go back to these situations. But for example, the individual going to prison, spinal cord injury, how are we going to help that person navigate that environment of prison? And you need to be able to get that information. So you have to learn how to curb yourself or your feelings or your fears to be able to engage with that person in that setting, in that situation, to be a good therapist. Okay. You don't have to agree with some of the choices they've made in life. You don't have to agree with their profession or those things, but you're there to make sure that they are safe and that they're getting what they need for their chosen life. Okay. Improve and maintain function. That's the same thing. Promote growth and development. If someone trusts me, we're going to grow together with that person. They're going to say, hey, all right, she's here. I trust that she's going to give me the best that I need for what I want to do as a client. Increase coping skills. So if you can interact with those people, they're going to gain different skills from you and they're going to be able to learn from you. Okay, so the essential characteristics of therapeutic use of self. What do we got to do to have good therapeutic use of self? Kind of just touched on it. Recognize individuality and that each person is unique. They aren't you. They didn't live where you live. They didn't grow up where you grew up. They don't have the same story you have. You got to get past that and you got to want to know their story. Respecting dignity and rights of others despite their past or present situation. Just talked about that, okay? Literally worked with people discharged from my inpatient hospital, rehab hospital, to jail. Okay, that was their discharge plan. They didn't know. Okay, cops showed up in the morning in suits and took them to prison. I can't let that hinder what I see in their abilities or their deficits and how I'm going to help that, because it's not my job to make decisions legally for their life. If it's prison, if they did something wrong, that's not my role. My role is to identify that they need help in certain areas and I'm going to help them. And it's someone else's job to identify those other areas that they maybe have to deal with. Empathy to share experiences of an individual, but maintain your own sense of self. You want to share experiences, but you don't want to give them everything. You also don't need to start becoming them or carrying the burdens that they have. So if they're scared about going home or they're in an abusive relationship, you can empathize or share experiences, but you should not be carrying the weight of that world on your shoulders, okay? Compassion, humility to recognize own limitations. That's a huge one, you guys, as therapists. I know this is for the NBCOT, but I think this is a great platform to learn about yourself while you're studying for this test. And one of those things is your own limitations. You got to know them, okay? My limitation, I would say one of my biggest limitations is that I have the compassion and I have the quiet, soft voice, but it's harder for me to pull that out than it is coaching and really like pushing people in a coaching style. That is who I am. I'm an athlete. I played collegiate sports. And so I love to coach. So my mentality is more, no, I show that I care through a coaching style, pushing you, encouraging you. And that is a limitation. It causes some people who need a lot of that reassurance or a lot of that guidance to wonder if I care or if I'm doing the best for them. Unconditional positive regard for each person, okay? Positive regard for each person. You have to find that within you to be the best therapist you can be, okay? Flexibility, relaxed humor, and self-awareness. I think that's the best one. Building that relationship, you find out people's level of humor, their sense of humor, and how you can interact with them. Issues that can negatively affect therapeutic relationships. Negative attitudes, fear, or hostility. Guys, it's scary. I 100% using my experiences, walking into a room where someone is going to be on trial for murder eventually. People in the gang that he supposedly shot somebody from are still out in the community trying to figure out where he's at. People are coming and going into his room, not sure when I'm in there if they're friend or foe. So you have to find a way to work through that. Resistance to establish rapport. If you don't agree with someone's lifestyle, maybe they're homosexual and you don't agree with that and their partner is there. How are you going to handle that? You're not establishing rapport if you're not asking about their life, if you're not asking about their narrative story and using that reasoning to help develop a plan. Okay. Communication difficulties. That's where I just talked about if they speak different languages, if they don't have the same educational level as you, you have to be able to identify that. Dependency, huge one. So the next two, dependency, transference, and countertransference, very, very tough things to always recognize. But dependency is making this that they need you all the time, okay? It's hindering their ability to be independent. I experienced this. Had a guy, 20-some years old, spinal cord injury, became very dependent on me, saying like, I won't go to therapy if I don't have you. I'm not coming back to outpatient if you're not my therapist. That's great. We built a good therapeutic rapport, but it got so dependent that he found me on Facebook and was messaging me about all of the issues he was experiencing out in the community and not trying to just, live his best life and bring some of those issues back to therapy when we had scheduled time. Transference and countertransference. Transference would be the therapist taking on a role and then that client taking on the other role. So an example they give in your book is a parent and a child. The client becomes kind of the parent, or the therapist kind of becomes the parent. The client becomes the child. It's not a good thing. Okay. It doesn't encourage independence. Difficulties in expressing feelings, over involvement. Okay. Talking to people too much about their personal relationships, their job, their bosses, they're way too much. Okay. Difficulty with developing individual therapeutic styles that is comfortable. Who are you? If you haven't figured that out yet, and you're going to be taking this test and you're going through some of these videos, think about that. What are you? What do you bring forth? Are you shy and quiet? Are you a little more loud and coaching in nature? Do you have a lot of strong beliefs that may hinder your therapeutic use of self? That's okay. Just be aware of them. So in those situations, you can maybe move somebody to a different therapist while you work through those biases, okay? And then finally, supervision and support. Having supervision and support really helps us build that therapeutic use of self, okay? It helps us to identify what we want to be therapeutically. It helps us with those issues in therapeutic relationships. When I was in school, a huge bias of mine was treating people that were grossly obese. That was a huge bias. I didn't know how to not offend, but encourage, but help them, because a lot of that hindrance came from excessive weight and just being immobile. And so that's something I worked through, and I feel worked through in a very healthy, good way into my beginning my practice. So the first 2 years of practice, getting more exposure to that population and getting guidance and support from my teammates, from other therapists on how I should view this and how I can help them, as opposed to putting my foot down and saying, I don't know what to do because this feels out of control to me. and improves applying therapeutic skills in daily life. How do we interact with our friends? How do we interact with our coworkers? How do we interact with our parents? That is what this builds for therapeutic use of self. And again, this is going to be throughout your entire exam, you guys. It's going to talk about, there's ethical questions in here. How do you deal with certain situations? And again, that is really going to be looking at you identifying boundaries, having therapeutic use of self, and identifying where you can continue to grow as a therapist. Great day today. I hope you have a great day. Again, I'm always showing this. This is edition 9, just using this as a guide for these because I really believe in this book and I believe in its strengths in helping you pass that NBCOT exam. So that was part of chapter 3, and I hope you have a wonderful day.